Okay, so let everybody know that you are being recorded. We're going to post this on our website afterwards. So folks, if they want to access this, again, they can do that. I've also been contacted, for example, by folks from the Craig School of Business at Fresno State that they couldn't make this meeting, but they want to hear what Robert has to say. So without further ado, I want to introduce our guest. Very gracious of him to spend some time joining us. I don't want to embarrass him too much here, but he did tell me that he's getting married in a month. So he's a busy guy, but he's taking time out to join us to talk about this report that he did with the co-author about supporting distressed communities by strengthening regional public universities. And it's a federal proposal. So Robert Maxim is a senior research associate with the Brookings Institution in Washington. He has done a lot of work for them in other capacities. He's served, for example, as a senior analyst with the Boston Consulting Group. Those of you that know management consulting firms know that that's a top consulting firm where he specialized in trade policy and economic development. I don't want to take any of his time up. So without further ado, I'm going to toss it over to Robert. He's going to talk for about 20 minutes or so about the proposal, and then we're going to open up to Q&A. So, and if you want, you can put your questions in the chat room. I will do my best to try to keep up with those questions, and we'll make this an ongoing conversation. So with that, Robert, the floor is yours.
Hey, thanks so much, Mark. And let me know at any point if you can't hear me. Sometimes my headphones kind of go on strike here. So, I'll do my best to make sure we have no technical issues. Thanks so much for the introduction. Everyone, I'm Robert Maxim. I'm a senior research associate at the Brookings Institution, working in the Metropolitan Policy Program, focused on a host of different issues, one of which is in particular regional public universities or regional comprehensive universities, kind of depending on who you talk to and kind of what subclass they're talking about. And most recently, I'm the author of a report called Helping America's Distressed Community. Oh, sorry, I actually got the wrong report up. It's a report focused on regional public universities and supporting distressed communities. Let me actually pull up the exact title here so I have it for all of you all. One too many reports on this topic pulled up in front of me.
By the way, folks can access that report. It's a PDF, so you can access that report by going online. And you can read it.
And the title is Supporting Distressed Communities by Strengthening Regional Public Universities. It's pretty straightforward federal policy proposal. And so, as Mark was alluding to, what is the issue here that we're trying to solve? What is the problem? In our view, the overarching problem that we're trying to solve is that if the coming recovery resembles the last two, it will likely be spatially uneven, with some places making a quick recovery and others falling behind with continued economic distress. And as my team at Brookings has previously written, the distinction between those places that recover quickly or are already doing so in many cases, and those that are likely to continue struggling won't be random. Rather, we anticipate that places that have long been high growth will continue to do so. And while those that have faced years or even decades of distress will fall further behind, both in relative and in some cases, even absolute terms. So why does this matter? Quite simply, in our minds, because millions of people in these so-called left behind communities will have to contend with worsened prospects for finding well-paying, accessible work, and that in turn, will harm their quality of life. So just to zoom out a little bit here and set some context, why is this happening? Why is this kind of growing economic divergence been ongoing? So, most neoclassical economic theories would suggest that, when there's an outflow of workers from a region, wages in that region should rise as labor becomes scarcer, and there should be a corresponding inflow of new workers as individuals from higher cost regions move back to take advantage of the region's lower cost. And so that basically held true until the middle of the 20th century or so, that relationship. But over the last 50 years, that process of convergence between, high wage, high cost areas and low wage, low cost areas has really broken down. And since then, we've seen a pull away of what we kind of colloquial in our term called superstar metro areas from the rest of the country. So, for example, data from my colleagues Mark Muro and Jacob Witten at Brookings shows that the top 2% of metro areas in the country have seen wages grow by 15 percentage points more than the national average since 1980. And during that time, the top 2% of metros have seen employment grow by about 40 percentage points more than the national average. And then if you want to take an even narrower slice, among the most high-tech innovation jobs, so these are like, think of your, the Amazon jobs that are paying $80,000 to $150,000 a year, you're really export-rooted advanced services and advanced manufacturing jobs. These most high-tech innovation jobs, 90% of all growth in the innovation sector since 2005 has occurred in just 5 coastal metro areas: Seattle, San Francisco, San Jose, San Diego, and Boston. So 5 places account for 90% of the most high-wage, highly productive jobs in the US right now. Okay, so we understand why that trend is happening, but why do we need to care about distressed places? That's a question we get asked a lot. For one thing, these superstar metro areas, the most high growth places in the US, just don't have the housing stock or infrastructure to accommodate a growing influx of people the way that migration patterns are currently happening. So that's why you see, for example, skyrocketing rents in many of the most prominent superstar metro areas across the US. At the same time, even if there was capacity to accommodate a massive influx of workers, it's not actually clear that that's how the US labor market is functioning anymore. And in fact, some evidence from Brookings, but also from elsewhere, has shown that migration in the US is now largely segregated along educational lines. So in other words, workers with a higher education are now significantly more likely to migrate to a new place than those with a high school diploma or less. So in this regard, less educated workers tend to be more place-bound than highly educated workers. That's not necessarily a bad thing. There are a variety of not just economic advantages, but also cultural and human connections that come from living in a place that you have extensive ties to. What becomes a problem, though, is that when the number of jobs in a place is declining and a significant portion of the region's highly educated workers have left, that can begin a toxic economic cycle that leaves the place with fewer people and fewer jobs. And not only that, but the jobs that are left behind tend to be localized service jobs, generally speaking, with lower wages, less productivity, and less upward economic mobility for workers. So to situate that in context, for a place like the San Joaquin Valley, which is situated relatively closely to some of the largest superstar metros in the country, San Francisco, San Jose, Los Angeles, San Diego, those metros attract some of the most highly educated workers in search of the highest pay, and that tends to come at the expense of places like the San Joaquin Valley. Now, that's not universal, right? There are a variety of economic assets and highly educated, highly skilled, high wage workers and job opportunities in the San Joaquin Valley. But generally speaking, these trends have found places like San Joaquin Valley on the wrong side of them, and that's harmed, without a doubt, the long-term economic prospects. And I think it's something that, unfortunately, the Valley has been, not only suffering through this, but largely neglected when it comes to some of the most robust federal interventions that could be supporting it. So my view is that this trend of education-based sorting and migration creates both an economic and moral imperative to help places left behind. It's not just enough, in my mind, to suggest that we fit more workers into San Francisco, in part because it's not clear that many of the workers most in need are going to want to move there anyway. We need to do more to help communities being left behind and help people in the places they are currently. And so that's where our proposal comes in. To help many of the distressed places in the US, we propose a new federal program providing grants of between $25 and $50 million paid over 5 years to regional public universities situated in distressed communities. These grants would be unique among federal programs supporting higher education, and that they would be specifically aimed at supporting schools' economic and community development missions. And we identify, and to be clear, we're using a very conservative estimate, at least 140 institutions nationwide that could be eligible, including Fresno State. But we actually think Congress can and should consider going bolder in establishing this program in really what has become a pretty fragile moment for the economic recovery, especially with the Delta variant surging and economic indicators slowing. So one of the questions we get asked a lot, and really looking forward to Q&A at the end so we can talk some. I know I'm going through a lot right now, but happy to dive into some of this in more detail. Why root this through regional public universities? Well, evidence shows the importance of anchor institutions like higher education institutions to support economic community development, particularly at the local and regional level. Universities themselves are economic drivers, I think most folks on the call probably know that, right? They hire a significant number of employees, create a large pool of local and regional spending, and they help develop a skilled local workforce. They also serve importantly as conveners, bringing together different economic and community development actors in a region to coordinate these types of efforts. But to date, most of the focus for federal higher education support has been trained on large research universities. These institutions are of course important. The research that R1 universities and land-grant universities conduct has tremendous benefits for the nation and the world, and very real local economic spillovers. And technology transfer and commercialization also has important benefits for seeding regional clusters in particular. And then on the other end of the spectrum, current federal policy proposals, the reconciliation bill being first among them, are at least discussing the idea of establishing a universal free two-year college access program for all Americans. And so while that program is far from being guaranteed to be included in the final bill, we think community colleges are at least getting attention from federal policymakers in a way they haven't in the past. But left out of the discussion right now in our mind are regional public universities. Those are the four-year public universities that are not large land-grant or R1 institutions. These schools have a variety of really important documented benefits for communities, but have been relatively overlooked by the federal government to date. And so, for example, regional public universities conduct research, but it tends to be applied research with an emphasis on community and regional needs. They don't do as much technology transfer and commercialization, but they certainly do promote incubation for small businesses and provide other forms of economic support. And by serving underrepresented and place-bound students in particular, they're important sources of upward mobility for a region's workforce and overall regional dynamism. But then if you look at the data, in particular because of unsteady state appropriations, regional public universities have really been forced to scale back in some cases their community and economic development missions in recent years. Previous research from my team that came out last year focused on the Great Lakes regional public universities, but also some broader trends nationwide, found that from 2006, just before the Great Recession, to 2018, regional public universities were forced to reduce their inflation-adjusted public service spending, which includes community and economic development interests, by over 7% on a per-student basis. At the same time, expenses on instruction, academic support, and student services all increased by between 5 and 15% in real terms during that time. My hypothesis there is that as states cut back on higher educational appropriations and schools are forced to raise tuition, they necessarily need to spend more on their core mission of student and academic support. Students need to see that they're getting value for the greater tuition that they're paying. And so in a resource-constrained environment, that means that other missions like community and economic development fall by the wayside. And when that happens, it has negative effects for communities that these schools serve. And this is not to say that schools are intentionally doing this. What we've found is a variety of schools really taking Herculean efforts to do the best that they can, given the resource constraints that they have. But this is really, for higher education has been a resource-constrained environment in many states. Higher education appropriations never fully recovered in many places to their pre-recession levels, and that's had very real effects. So to get more into the details on this proposal, who would it serve and how would it work? We propose that the federal government should establish a new distressed community serving institution designation to be operated out of either EDA or the Department of Education. We think EDA in particular has long managed the existing University Centers program, which is a existing program that supports about 6 schools situated in distressed regions across the country. It's significantly smaller than what we're proposing, but it does have, in some ways, a similar mission and could serve as a baseline to expand or build out a newer, more expansive program. And again, I'm happy to get into the Q&A into more detail about why we think that program is inadequate and maybe some of the ways it could be scaled up. We believe that any public 4-year accredited university with a physical campus could theoretically be eligible, provided that they're serving a distressed neighborhood or region. And there are a variety of ways to define distress. One way we do so in our piece, and this is, what we try to emphasize is this is an illustrative example. It's not something that either EDA or the Department of Education would necessarily need to be wedded to. We think that they should use their judgment on the best way to define distress. But one way to do so is to leverage neighborhood distress, which is particularly useful for ensuring that schools in larger, well-off, but economically unequal metro areas like Chicago or New York can get included. So, in our work, we identify schools situated in a zip code with a median family income 30% below a relevant benchmark. So in low-income states, places like Arkansas, Mississippi, Louisiana, or Georgia, it would be below the national median family income. And then in high-income states, a place like California or Massachusetts, it would be 30% below the state median family income. And so, we identify 141 schools that meet that criteria, but that certainly isn't the only way to identify distress. In particular, our methodology misses some institutions whose campuses are situated in relatively high income areas, but that serve, distressed communities more broadly. So Cal State Stanislaus is an example of this. So we think EDA could and should also consider some alternate measures of distress. One could be, for example, if a school draws a certain share of students for one or more distressed communities, then it could be eligible and use federal funding to support economic and community development in those distressed communities that it draws from. So regardless of eligibility, we think that these grants should be allotted really in two steps. The first would be any school who's eligible would be able to receive a planning grant of between $100,000 and $200,000 to help defray the cost of putting together an implementation plan. We envision these grants could be used to hire one or two dedicated staff and pay for expenses to convene regional actors to really assemble a plan and secure commitments for outside funding. And then we also think that regions with multiple eligible universities should be allowed to coordinate their plans and submit joint applications. So the San Joaquin Valley is a great example of where there are multiple institutions that may want to coordinate their efforts and really serve a broader regional purpose. And then step two would be once the school's implementation plan is approved by either the EDA or Department of Education, it would unlock implementation grants of between $25 and $50 million to be paid over 5 years. And that would help fund investments being made in the community. These grants would also come with state maintenance of effort provisions. So the goal there is to avoid having states cut their funding to universities and basically supplant rather than supplement funding. That's been in use extensively in recent years, whether that was the 2009 Recovery Act or the CARES Act and American Rescue Plan more recently. So we think that that would be a pretty straightforward thing that you'd need to include. And as to what type of projects these grants would support, we really try to cast a broad net. Physical redevelopment would obviously be allowed, but it shouldn't be the entirety of a project. Other potential uses of money could include things like entrepreneurship and business development services with a focus on underrepresented groups like women and entrepreneurs of color, job creation and matching programs to connect long-term unemployed local residents to jobs, increasing digital infrastructure such as broadband connections, increasing regional capacity to address public health or chronic economic challenges, improving local elementary and secondary education quality with the aim of bolstering post-secondary enrollment rates, and finally conducting community relevant research aimed at serving local or regional economic and community needs. And so to facilitate all of this, we would suggest establishing a federal office of distress serving institutions, either at the EDA or Department of Education. And we envision the role of that office would be not only certifying universities as eligible, but also conducting knowledge sharing, information retention, and hosting convenings to encourage the exchange of best practices. We think really these universities should become a sort of community of practice, with the broader implication being for all higher education institutions, including those not actively participating in the program. We think that some really good examples could come out of this program if well structured and well documented. I recognize I've only got about 2 minutes left here, but I think I would be remiss if I didn't at least briefly touch on the economic and community impacts of this type of program. So for policymakers in particular, there's rightly so a strong interest in the economic impacts of a program and an investment like this. As a first order of analysis, we conducted a return on investment to the federal government and to states using economic multipliers from the Economic Policy Institute. We estimate that a $50 million investment, depending on how it's allocated, could recruit between 3 and 12 million to the federal government in the form of increased tax collection and generate between 1 and 5 million for states in tax revenue. And again, that's on a project level basis. $150 million investment. But a simple ROI analysis like that really misses the more important downstream impacts of a program like this. Each type of investment would have a variety of other effects that are more difficult to quantify. So for example, closing the digital divide helps a business by allowing them to establish an online presence and sell to customers outside their local area. At the same time, entrepreneurs can more easily connect to financing, manufacturing, and agricultural operations, can adopt the latest technologies, and students and adults can more easily access distance learning. Each of these has significant long-term economic effects. And then finally, I think it's just important to note the current policy moment. Generally speaking, I think we've seen a lot of dysfunction from our federal government, particularly the legislative branch for the better part of the last decade. But right now, we think there are multiple major place-based policies being considered by Congress, and we really see them as interlocking parts of a broader strategy. So, on the broadest level, programs like the Regional Tech Hubs program contained in the bipartisan U.S. Innovation and Competition Act can help metropolitan areas really regenerate their economic growth. One level down, we think grant programs like those being proposed by Representative Derek Kilmer of Washington State can begin solving region-wide distress. And then programs like the one we're suggesting can really help catalyze action by directly supporting the anchor institutions that'll be responsible for carrying out a lot of this regional and economic development work. So as a final takeaway, I'd just say that no single program will be able to fully solve economic distress in every place, but we do believe that a concerted federal effort to support regional public universities that serve distressed communities can help both stem some of the higher education disinvestment that's happened over the last decade, while also promoting a more spatially and racially equal economic recovery. So, I know we're a little bit over time. I appreciate that. Mark, happy to kind of chat with the group in whatever way they'd like to go.
I'm going to mute myself. We're going to wait for some questions to come in, but I've got some questions, Robert, as you know, I always do when you and I talk. So you don't have to answer this if you don't feel it's appropriate. I'm going to throw it out there anyway. The politics of this. I mean, we've got an infrastructure package that's being debated in Congress right now that seems to be a Democrat-only deal. There's, Joe Manchin's talking about paring it back. So is it realistic to see this as part of that? Or is it more realistic to see this as part of something else standalone or something that already exists, some other legislation that already exists that's been passed on a bipartisan basis?
Yeah, it's a great question. So the first thing I'd just say is, despite the fact that I think that this program would have really positive economic effects for local communities and regions, at the end of the day, the spending is basically a drop in the bucket compared to what Congress has put out so far, including the current $3.5 trillion with a T dollar plan that they're considering. We estimate that the annual spend on this program would be about $1.5 billion a year. So again, it's a tiny fraction of what Congress is considering.
Can I just jump in there for a second, Robert, just to give it, and correct me if I'm wrong, but my understanding is this $3.5 trillion number really represents about $200 billion a year over a 10-year period ish. And so when we're talking about, put it in context, we're talking about 1.5 billion compared to, against 200 billion. So it would be, less than 1%.
Yeah, that's right. And it's 200, I think it's, for example, 200 billion of new spending, 350 of total spending, right? And so, we think it's a drop in the bucket given the amount of economic benefit it would have for the places receiving the money. The one obstacle I see coming out of the reconciliation bill is that, as you mentioned, that it's a pretty partisan exercise. And I think that the geography of distress really makes this program conducive to being a pretty bipartisan proposal. And, we've had some conversations with, members of Congress on both parties. I think that there's some general interest, and there's interest in particular from members from red states. So, I think because of that, there's probably less inclination to put it in something like a reconciliation bill, which is going to be a partisan exercise, and which right now is being pared back, I think, to kind of accommodate Senator Manchin's, demands. And so I find it probably unlikely that it'll be included in that bill, but we're hoping that there can be kind of a broader bipartisan discussion around this, maybe linked to a broader higher education bill in the next year.
Feel free, folks, don't be shy. Please write your questions in the chat. I'd be happy to ask Robert them, but I'll keep the conversation going. One thing I want to talk about a little bit is closing the digital divide that exists in the Valley. A lot of people thought that, this is actually, with the move towards Zoom, like we're doing today, really would help the Valley. Getting these, for example, high-tech workers away from, high-cost areas on the coast and moving to, like, for example, northern parts of the Valley, like Merced and Modesto, et cetera. But you're saying that, telework really hasn't equalized the economic gap between regions. Can you explain that a little bit?
That's actually exactly what we found. And so there's a couple of good sources on this. The first was a recent piece by the New York Times using Postal Service data. And what they found was that, largely speaking, migration patterns in 2020 pretty much look like 2019 with a couple of small exceptions. And those being that there was a larger than normal exodus from superstar metros urban cores to periphery communities in those same metro areas. So people are moving from downtown San Francisco to other communities in the San Francisco metro area, but maybe they want a backyard. The other is, the communities that did have a real net influx of workers tended to be, vacation communities that were adjacent to, an existing superstar metro area. So I actually grew up, on Cape Cod. My family's Native American. There's a very small Native American reservation there, and we grew up there. And that was actually the fourth largest influx of any community in the U.S. So a vacation community like Cape Cod really did see an influx of workers with problems there. But for the vast majority of places, that type of influx didn't happen. And actually, we found that migrations from superstar metro areas into communities in the interior of the country accounted for basically less than 2% of the workforce of those places. So just 0.2% of the workforce of those places. So I was off by an order of magnitude there. So the number of workers that are moving out of superstar metro areas into communities throughout the country, including the San Joaquin Valley, it's not large enough to make a really substantive economic difference. And a big part of that in some ways too is also the connectivity issues that do exist in many more rural and lower income places in the U.S. That's a barrier. So we do really think that the digital divide is exacerbating that trend.
We're very fortunate to be joined by two of the three presidents of our California State University campuses here in the Valley. Lynnette Zelezny from CSU Bakersfield is here. New president at Fresno State, Saúl Jiménez-Sandoval is here. Ellen Jun from Stanislaus State couldn't make it, but her director of government relations, Naisha Rhodes, is on this Zoom as well. So a lot of important people here. One of the people that wants to ask a question is President Jiménez-Sandoval. I'll just say this before before he asks his question is, I will note that in your report, excellent picture on the first page of your report of Fresno State. So with that, President Jiménez-Sandoval, your question.
Thanks, Mark. And I want to thank you, Robert, and your team for this incredible, insightful idea that you have. Number one, I'd like to point out that the impact on distressed communities should be the driving force of all of this. Because I see with both President Zelezny's and then in my case as well, and of course also in President Young's case, that the university is a comprehensive university that really impacts a region, not the neighborhood around the university. And that's really important to note that within the Fresno region specifically, the impact of Fresno State permeates every single facet of Valley life around us very specifically. So it's not just a neighborhood. In our case, our neighborhood would be the entire region around us. In President Zelezny's case as well, I'm sure that's the case, as well as President Young's. And then number two, I really want to talk about perception and history of how it is that the R1s perceive us, these regional comprehensive universities. In the case of the CSU, in the 1970s, we were determined, or we were known to be just a teaching university. Recently, though, within the past 30 years, more and more, we are, as you pointed out, producing really high quality research that is very community specific, that complements the research coming out of the UCs, or that complements the research coming out of the private universities such as USC as well. So within this, I'd like to advocate for a very strong, comprehensive and holistic approach to addressing the regional economies with the power of the UCs even though we have a UC, right up the road from us, a UC Merced, they can't lift it all by themselves. We have to combine our forces, and the forces have to be combined with the four-year comprehensive universities of the CSU, specifically within the Valley as well. And then my question, that was my comments, though, the 3-point comments. So then my question to you then would be to review again that process of awarding. If everything goes well, if this goes through and it is at the end funded, you mentioned the $100,000 to $200,000 implementation grant. What would be the process through which universities are chosen or not chosen for the $25 to $50 million grant? Because I really think that that's going to be really difficult, for example, to say, Stanislaus gets this much, but Fresno State does not, or vice versa in relationship to Bakersfield. We have very different strengths, but the strengths that we have, we can leverage them tremendously. I can see President Zelezny, for example, with energy. She's an incredible energy university. With us, it would be agriculture. So how would, I guess the process really is what interests me the most at this point. And sorry if I was long-winded.
No, it's a great question. And actually that's, I think, one of the biggest problems right now with the current existing federal program that is designed to this effort, the University Center program. And I think it's got a variety of shortcomings, but one of the biggest ones is that the funding is so limited that it can't guarantee that every potentially eligible university ends up selected. And so, and the problem with almost any challenge grant is it ends up funding the schools that are best able to put together a proposal rather than those that necessarily have the highest economic need or, the best regional coordination. And so one of the things that we try and emphasize, and we try to talk about this in the piece, but also in our conversations with policymakers to date, is that the funding should be adequate, that any eligible university can qualify. So if you are eligible for an implementation grant, and provided you meet a series of, I think requirements that EDA would probably have to lay out around what they're looking for in their plans, you should also be eligible for the $25 to $50 million grant. I would almost imagine this almost more as like an entitlement than a challenge grant, but rather than being for individuals, it would be for institutions. So that's how we've been approaching it in conversations. And I think it's precisely because of what you're talking about, the idea that, there are regions that have different needs and different strengths, and that isn't always reflected in the choices the federal government makes when they're issuing final awards. Typically that's done for, reasons of resource scarcity. And then kind of your second point around institutions coordinating, I think one of the things that, we have been emphasizing to policymakers as well is really that secondary level of allowing institutions to coordinate across a state or across a region to submit a joint application. And I think that would be kind of critical for a place like the San Joaquin Valley, which has different institutions that have different strengths, and then different communities within it that have different needs. And so that's where I think that would come in. I could really see a kind of a joint application being put in. And I think that would be something that, we would hope that EDA would want to prioritize in its final selections if this program goes through.
It's one of the nice things about the Maddy Institute. It's currently configured is that we work with the 4 public universities in the San Joaquin Valley while we're housed at Fresno State and proud to be on the campus for many years. We do work with all 4 campuses, and Cal State Bakersfield and Cal State Stanislaus in particular on this issue. I want to introduce President Lynnette Zelezny from Cal State Bakersfield. She is not only on our board, she actually had some beginnings here at Fresno State before she went on to take on the presidency at Bakersfield, done some great things down there. One of the things I wanted to ask Lynnette, and maybe she can comment on, is, there's Kern County's big in energy, right? Leading energy producer in the state. They're going through some transitions now as we move away from fossil fuels and toward clean energy. Has huge implications for the economy of Kern County. So President Zelezny, I wonder if you could make some comments in that regard.
Oh, I'd be happy to. And I want to thank you again, Robert. I've learned a lot about this potential opportunity, and thank you for giving us advice about, how to strengthen a proposal. But I do want to give context here. So while we work together very well and as collaborators in the San Juan Key Valley, it is important to note how extremely large we are and how unique we are in our sense of place. And so I do want to comment that the San Joaquin Valley very much is an identified area that is serving distressed communities. But just to contrast, as you go to the southern San Joaquin Valley, where Bakersfield is located, so in Kern County is about the size of Connecticut. So I do not have a four-year university within 100 miles of me. And not only that, but as my colleague, Dr. Jiménez-Sandoval mentioned, our strengths in terms of our expertise vary. So here in the southern San Joaquin Valley, we are making tremendous strides. And I want to thank Merrick Gutman, who's on with you today from the Brookings Institute, who's worked with us on a planning inclusive workforce development called the Better Bakersfield Boundless Kern B3K Workforce Development, which is actually, it sounds very similar to what the planning stage of this proposal would be. And we've already identified through this work 5 areas. One of the areas of industry opportunity, of course, is energy. We in Bakersfield, Kern County are at the epicenter of energy, but not only that, aerospace, this is where aerospace history is made in the United States. It's the epicenter of that as well. And identified was entrepreneurship, business services, and advanced manufacturing. We have moved forward in thinking about the alignment of the B3K, particularly with the university strategic plan on energy, because as you'll note from the politics of our state, is that we will need to transition from petroleum as an energy source to thinking about innovative energy. And so we are prepared, thanks to the work of the lead at Brookings and the inclusive work that we've done here in Kern County and the city of Bakersfield, we're prepared to move forward to be a hub, which will be very different from the work that will happen at Fresno State and likewise at Stan State. So just wanted to, put this, on your radar while we are all working together to lift this community. And I see my friend Michael Turnipseed is on here. We're thinking about how do we bring in underrepresented students into these jobs that have been identified by our Brookings planning committee, into these jobs that will pay well, that will again allow families to live well and have high quality of living. So help us think through, if some of us are already have our plan and it's diverse from what will happen in Fresno, although certainly still all lifting the San Joaquin Valley. How should we position ourselves to best utilize this proposition? Because what I just heard you say is, get into the planning phase and be approved for that, and then move to the implementation phase. So give me an idea about your thoughts about how Kern County, Bakersfield, since we've already now got the leverage of our inclusive workforce development plan with a specific 5 areas of potential, building of workforce need. How might we still be a good candidate for this federal money?
Yeah, it's a great question. Thank you, President Zelezny. And one thing I'd say is, and I'm familiar with the B3K effort. Given some of the work that Brookings has done there. The reality is you're ahead of the curve on a lot relative to a lot of communities nationwide, and not only relative to a lot of communities, but a lot of higher educational institutions as well. And so our view is that just because you're ahead of the curve doesn't mean you should be penalized for that. You're doing good work on your own, but that doesn't mean that should make you ineligible, or it doesn't mean that you should receive fewer resources, because the reality is you've been doing that a lot, on your own as regional leaders, and you're still the federal government is still underinvesting in you as a community relative to what they should be doing, at least in my opinion. And so you're doing this in many ways, in spite of, having fewer resources rather than because you have more resources, right? So that would be the first thing I would say, is that, it is impressive what you all are doing, and that, you should have more support in doing what you're already doing. The second thing I would say is that, I think that if you have already got something going in, then that is the type of conversation that should be had with the federal government and EDA around, we've already got a vision for this plan. Not every place does. You already do. If you are in a place where you feel confident that you can move straight through to an implementation grant, then I think that that's something that EDA should consider allowing. That being said, there may still be opportunities left for you to leverage that type of funding as an institution. I'm thinking of, and I'm sure you've already done this, but ways to engage further with, in particular, private sector actors. Ways to bring in other nonprofit and philanthropic co-investors to do local level work that you all are operating on. I think to the extent that you feel like you still want additional resources to dig into maybe sector specific strategies further, that could be one way to leverage that type of money. But then, I'd say in terms of the 25 to 50 million, that's certainly something that you should be eligible for and would hopefully be a leader in terms of consideration by the federal government. And I still think that money is hugely important to, support your institution being able to have dedicated funds to put skin in the game, and to, co-invest with partners in the region. And so many schools that we've worked with are already doing that. But it's being done, using their own funding that they have or specific funding that they've raised for that effort. Meanwhile, the federal government is, and it's a lot of good comes out of it, but they are pouring, $1.5 billion a year into the land grant program, $28 billion a year into federal research, and in that funding, in many ways, largely bypasses, the regional public universities that we're talking about today. So, for all of the good that you're doing right now, you're kind of doing it on your own. And our view is that, the federal government has been a co-investor for years with R1 institutions and with land grant institutions, and it's time for them to be a co-investor with you all as well.
I think that probably says that one of the things I'm going to add to the list to do is ask Michael Turnipseed to give Kevin McCarthy a call and say, Congressman McCarthy, this is a good idea. You should get behind it. That would be a good thing. The point, though, that President Zelezny makes is a good one. The San Joaquin Valley is not a monolith. There are very different things happening in the southern part of the valley, the central part of the valley, and the north part of the valley. And so, as President Zelezny notes, energy, huge issue in Kern County. As President Jiménez-Sandoval notes, agriculture is a huge thing in the central part of the San Joaquin Valley. And I would say this, that, Bakersfield, I don't know if President Zelezny would agree with me on this, is almost becoming part of Los Angeles. I mean, you're seeing people kind of commute in, and the North Valley is becoming kind of part of either the Bay Area metro area, or of Sacramento. The central San Joaquin Valley is kind of unto itself a little bit. And Fresno State obviously is the 800-pound gorilla, certainly in this area. So the kind of unique things that are going on at each of the institutions is kind of relevant, though the entire region needs to be lifted. Now, I don't know if we have anybody from the North Valley who'd like to comment. I did see Marion Kanan on a little while ago. I don't know if she's still with us, but anybody from the North Valley want to comment at all about any questions they have about this proposal, how it would impact the northern part of the San Joaquin Valley?
Mark, I would just add to your comments just really quickly that even though we are very distinct, I think each one of us is the comprehensive university that really brings the entire community together around us. So I do agree with you with that caveat that we each are the epicenter for innovation in each one of our communities.
Right.
And actually, one other point that I'll make, kind of going off something that President Zelezny said, I really actually like, and I'm glad you brought up the point around being the only four-year university within a 100-mile radius. One piece of work that we're thinking about doing right now is kind of a very brief follow-on piece to this with, alternative considerations from policymakers. One of the things that when we were putting this piece together, the list of universities that we made was really designed to be illustrative. I think our thought was that, policymakers would run with it with their own set of criteria, because EDA in particular already has a couple different definitions that they use for distress. So, but I think it's become clear too that not only universities, but policymakers have a really strong interest in the different types of criteria that should go into this, and maybe don't necessarily have as much of a hold on it as we were originally thinking. So we're thinking about putting together kind of a shorter secondary piece around considerations for policymakers and ways to define distress. And so in addition to what we've already done, which I think had a really strong neighborhood level focus, things around looking at enrollment trends, using IPEDS data or clearinghouse data to actually look at where enrollment is happening and bring, if an institution is serving students from those distressed communities. But I also think the distance one is an important one. There's a lot of economic literature that shows that the economic impacts of an institution, particularly one in a more rural area, can extend upwards of 60 to almost 100 miles. And if you're the only institution in that area, that should be an important consideration on two levels: from the economic development side and being the anchor for that area, but also from the educational access and economic mobility side. You are potentially the only gateway for affordable, accessible higher education for many of the students and workers in the place that you're situated. And so, I think that that's one of the considerations that we've already got on our radar for this follow-on piece. But I just want to say I really appreciate that point being raised.
If I may, and I really appreciate the fact that you note that, because as you look at the state of California, what you'll note is that if you look at just one number, an average, it looks as if the rate of high school graduates that will qualify for college will go flat. However, if you disaggregate it and you look at the San Joaquin Valley, you'll see what we are all living with as presidents here in the San Joaquin Valley. Our enrollments are skyrocketing and they're not likely to stop. So both Jiménez-Sandoval and President Jun, we have had to go to our chancellor to say, look, we are unlike anywhere else in California. This is the place where our communities are, we are desperate for additional spaces, and we need that enrollment growth because we have such pent-up demand. And this is, again, really, this is where the land is, to build. So for the state of California to really thrive, the focus really needs to be on increasing those opportunities and also that federal funding to recognize that the central San Joaquin Valley in California is the last part of this Golden State that can really make a difference in the future of California in terms of it continuing to thrive.
Okay, can I follow up with a few points from what President Zelezny said? When we were considering economic development a number of years ago, Fresno County was looking for a tagline, and my suggestion was, Fresno County, we have no faults. There's no fault lines. I thought that was a good tagline. It's true that a lot of the economy is kind of moving into the valley. I want to give you two things to think about, kind of a macro and a micro. From a macro perspective, the San Joaquin Valley is among the poorest regions in the nation. When they were talking about this proposal of dividing California up into 5 different states, they said if you did that and San Joaquin Valley was a state, it would be literally the poorest state in the nation, or the Mississippi or Alabama. And oh, by the way, it would be adjacent to the richest state in the nation, the Bay Area and San Jose. That just gives you a real clear picture of the disparity between the inland California and coastal California. The second thing, on more of a micro level, you have a unique opportunity in the San Joaquin Valley. Primarily, a lot of times this is personality driven or people driven. The current chancellor of the California State University system is the former Fresno State president. The 3 presidents of our state universities here in the Valley all started or had spent time at Fresno State, and they all know each other. which is kind of a unique thing, I think, among universities. So I think it sets up our universities and our region as a really unique place to do a pilot program for this proposal that you're making. We are running out of time. We've only got a few more minutes. Does anyone have any questions they'd like me to ask? You can raise your hand if you'd like. I don't see
What
any.
are the next steps?
What are the next steps? Great question. That's a great way to end too.
That is a great question. So we've been in conversation with a variety of policymakers on the federal level, both House and Senate. And I think that there's some genuine interest in doing something here. I think in particular, California, policymakers in California have had some strong interest, both in the House and Senate. So I would say a couple of things. The first is, we're a 501c3. We don't lobby. We talk to everyone that wants to come talk with us. And so that's what we've been doing. We've had probably half a dozen conversations with lawmakers and state and local policymakers. On top of that, in addition to the kind of half a dozen or so with federal lawmakers. So to the extent that, you all think this is important, one thing I will say is that it's always more impactful when a policymaker hears from one of their constituents that this matters than when they hear from, Brookings think tank author about the report that Brookings think tank author wrote. They get inundated with, dozens of think tank reports from Washington think tanks a week. Not all of them necessarily resonate with people in the places that they're representing. So to the extent that you think that this matters and that it does resonate, it's important to tell them that. We're going to continue having, I think what have been so far very positive conversations around this program, answering policymakers' questions around the nuances that go into it, having conversations pretty similar actually to the ones that we had today. And so, to the extent that you think it is helpful to have those conversations, please do on your end as well. We're hoping that maybe over the next 6 months to a year, something could really come together here. And I think that what will matter is, kind of after we get through this current surge of policymaking and everyone says, all right, what's next? Making sure that this is on the top of everyone's mind at that moment.
I wanted, we only have about 3 more minutes left, but I wanted to make sure we got a North Valley perspective. We're very fortunate to have Marion Kanan, who is the CEO of the Stanislaus Community Foundation, on with us. And so, Marion, I want to turn it over to you for a quick question, and maybe we can then wrap it up.
Sure. Were you going to ask me a question?
I'm going to let you ask any question you'd like to ask Robert about the use of the accessing regional public universities like Stanislaus State to help in terms of community and economic development. How do you see any? Do you have any questions in that regard, or?
The only thing I would say is more of a comment. And it's been my experience where we work wonderfully and closely with CSU Stanislaus. I think traditionally universities have been very siloed, and so us really laying a claim on our public universities to help solve local problems very meaningfully versus getting stuck in sort of their bureaucracy. That's my only concern. Is funding is awesome. Obviously, they have the intellectual capital, but really sort of creating a more permeated sort of, getting those walls to come down and really understand and work real time and very quickly, given sort of, public unions and faculty unions and the shared governance process tends to keep things a little stuck or slowed down in comparison to what the private sector needs are real time. So how would we address those concerns or that different pacing, and how would we alleviate for that, I guess is always the question I have.
Want to try to answer that, Robert?
Yeah, I'll do my best in about 30 seconds here. I think that's a very real conversation that's happening probably at every higher education institution in the country. One thing I'll say is, there are examples both of public institutions and private institutions that are doing this type of work right now. And I think that that's where really this federal government role as a coordinator would come in terms of sharing those best practices. I don't think it should necessarily be on universities to have to, compartmentalize and figure out every kind of challenge of coordinating with the private sector, in particular, if it's typically been something that they've done less of. And I know it varies, right? I mean, you all may be doing a lot more of it, and it's still a challenge, but I know some institutions have they may not even have the resources to begin thinking about it, or just the environment they're operating in, it's not realistic. So, I would hope that, one of the things that would come out of this federal effort and this community of practice is, a series of guidelines and best practices for really trying to break down those silos. But again, I think that that's going to be a challenge with any sort of, higher ed led regional development, or really any sort of anchor institution led economic development. But at the end of the day, I still think that, you all are the best resource available for a lot of these communities. So that's what I'd say.
If I can actually just jump in here for a second as we wrap up. Actually, in the report, there are a number of examples of public universities impacting economic and community development. One of the examples is in Northern Michigan University and the high-speed internet in Michigan's Upper Peninsula. And it was one of the things that we looked at when we were looking at how we close the digital divide in the Valley. They've done some fantastic work in Michigan. So the answer is these things do exist. There's a lot of regional public universities out there doing some really great work. I know there's great work being done at Fresno State and CSUB, et cetera. So I think that is a possibility. I totally understand being a faculty member for 30 plus years. Your point, sometimes process overwhelms result. But I think that we certainly have, visionaries in our leadership at our various universities to get beyond those walls, and then they see the bigger picture. So I'm very hopeful. I want to thank Robert Maxim with the Brookings Institution for being with us today. Thank you very much for spending time with us. Congratulations on your upcoming wedding. And thank all of you for joining us. And we'll see you next month. Thanks again.
Hey, thank you all.